I'm 36 and female, and recorded my husband's parents every time they criticized me, and then played it at the family reunion. For context, me and my husband Matthew have been married for 12 years, and together for several more. We have twins, and we live in a cozy little villa in the suburbs. I'm an artist, and I paint and sell my work on commission. I also illustrate for companies and children's books, though I am a freelancer. I earn more than the average with my skills, digital and paper. Matthew is the principal of the local high school. We are pretty well off and happy. I'd always known that marrying into Matthew's family would come with its own challenges. They're affluent, rich people with great influence, and Matthew's father has a huge business. They've had a good reputation around here. Matthew's mother acts like the typical socialite you only find in a movie. They go to parties, stuff like that. They constantly hover around their son and make sure all he needs, they're taken care of. They've always held him up to a certain standard, so obviously they were weary of me. After all, Matthew was their only son, and they had always kept a tight-knit family. But I never could have predicted just how difficult things were going to get. It felt like my in-laws were just relentlessly critical of everything I did, constantly nitpicking and finding fault with every decision I've made. They'd visit our house often and act superior to me. They'd even sneer at my parents' subtleness, making backhanded comments and showing off their wealth. They considered me a country bumpkin, with no sort of sophistication, even though I told them I grew up in the city. Matthew was blind to his parents' behavior, as this was the norm in their family, and he never really understood how rude they were being in his naivety. It started with my career. You see, as a freelance artist, I used the usual comments about how I was not pursuing a real job. But my in-laws took it to an absolute new level, constantly questioning whether I could support my family on such an unstable income. They believed that it wasn't a stable, lucrative profession, and that it would not provide the financial security that their son and grandchild deserved. They would often make comments about how I should consider finding a real job with a steady income, how I was wasting my time pursuing something that was never going to amount to anything. They would sometimes even go as far as tear up my paintings and call my art ugly. It was frustrating because I knew I could never be able to retaliate. They'd call people up and give negative feedback and utter baseless accusations, so I would not get any work. They'd visit when I had a workload, and just to keep me occupied and delay my deliveries. They were never easy on me, and would always try to get me to do something else, even though I was clearly rising and gaining success. Despite their criticisms, I was proud of my career and the work that I did. I knew that it was challenging to make a living as an artist, but it was something that I was passionate about, and I just loved the creative freedom it gave me. But no matter how much I tried to explain this to Matthew's parents, they just never seemed to understand it or accept it. Their disapproval of my career was just one of my many issues that I had with them, and it was frustrating to feel like I was constantly being judged and criticized, but I knew that I could not change their opinions, and I had to learn to accept that they would never fully understand or appreciate the work that I did. And when it came to my cooking skills, forget about it. Even if I spent hours preparing a meal, they would always find something to criticize. Whether it was too much salt or not enough seasoning, they would often make comments about how my meals lacked the flavor, or how they were just not prepared the way they were used to. They would compare my cooking to their own or other family members, making me feel like I was always just falling short. Their criticisms of my cooking made me feel even more insecure about my place in the family and my ability to provide for my husband and child. I felt like I was being judged on every single aspect of my life. From my career to my skills as a homemaker, it was a constant source of tension between us, and I often found myself dreading the visits of holidays where my cooking would be on full display. Their criticism of my cooking was just another way to try to assert their dominance and control over me. They wanted to make me feel inferior and inadequate, to show me that they were the ones in charge and that I needed to conform to their expectations. I could have dealt with these criticisms, even if they were hurtful. I know this because I would leave the ladle and the curry at a certain position, or keep the spoon in the salt jar in a very specific way. When I'd get back into the kitchen, I knew they'd meddled with it beyond fixing, but what really hurt was the way my in-laws criticized my parenting choices. Matthew's parents were always quick to criticize my parenting choices and undermine my authority as a mother. They would often question my decisions, suggesting that I was not doing things the right way or that I was making mistakes that could harm my children. As a mother of 2 young children, I was constantly second-guessing myself and trying to do what was best for them. But every time I tried to discipline my kids or make a decision about their education, my in-laws would just swoop in with their snarky comments. One of the ways they would do this was by offering unsolicited advice or opinions on how I should be raising my kids. They would make comments about how they had raised their own children and how things were done differently back then. They would also suggest that I was too lenient or strict with my kids, depending on their mood or their situation. Their constant interference and undermining of my authority made it so difficult for me to feel confident in my parenting abilities. It felt like I was always being watched and judged, like I could not make a decision without their approval. It was absolutely exhausting and demoralizing, and it made me feel like I was failing as a mother. Another way that they would try to control the way I took care of my children was by disregarding my rules and boundaries when they were with them. They would spoil them with sweets and treats, even when I had asked them not to, or they would let them stay up late or watch movies that were not appropriate for their age. Whenever I would confront them about their behavior, they would just brush it off and make an excuse, saying things like, "Oh, it's just little treat," or "It's okay to bend the rules sometimes, you know." But I knew that they were trying to undermine my authority and show my children that they were the ones in charge. The day I truly felt that they crossed a limit it was one I'll never forget. It was a weekday and I was supposed to pick them up from school. When I reached there, I found out my children never made it to school. So I called Matthew, who had dropped them off as the primary school and high school were next to each other. Matthew was shocked. He met me at the school entrance and we looked for hours at places they could be. Finally, we went home to check if they had somehow made it safely back home. There they were, drinking Coca-Cola out the bottle, watching a horror movie. Matthew was so darn confused, but I understood. All my suspicions were confirmed when we asked the children where they'd been. They told us that their grandma and grampy had taken them at the entrance and took them on a day out for bowling, then straight to the arcade, and finally they wrapped it up at the McDonald's. They went to the supermarket while coming back and bought loads of junk food. Apparently, they told the kids they would take them with our permission, and that they knew that we were out of school. They apologized for causing such panic and comforted us. My rage only calmed down a bit after this sweet and thoughtful display of affection. Their actions made it clear that they did not respect me as a mother or as a person. It was a constant battle to assert my authority and to make sure that my children knew that I was the one responsible for their care and well-being. I felt isolated and alone, like no one in my family even understood or appreciated me. And worst of all, they seemed to be completely unaware of the hurt that they were causing. They would make these criticisms behind closed doors, away from Matthew and the rest of the family. It was like they thought as long as they weren't saying it to Matthew's face, it did not count. I often felt like I was fighting this uphill battle against Matthew's parents. Their constant criticism and undermining of my authority left me feeling so lonely and inferior, like I was an outsider in my own family. I often felt like I was walking on eggshells around them, trying to avoid saying or doing anything that might set them off. Their criticism of my career as a freelance artist and my parenting skills made me feel like I was not good enough, like I was always falling short of their expectations. I knew that they did not consider me worthy of their son, and it was one of the reasons why I felt so anxious and insecure around them. Despite my efforts to improve my cooking skills and assert my authority as a mother, I could never seem to win their approval. It was like they were looking for something to criticize, and I could never quite measure up to their expectations. As the years went by, I became increasingly delusional with the family dynamics. I felt like I was trapped in this toxic cycle of criticism and control with no way out. I longed for a sense of belonging and acceptance within the family, but it seemed like an impossible dream. One day, as I was venting to a friend Rachel about my frustration, she suggested I start recording my in-laws whenever they started acting like this. At first, I was hesitant. That it seemed like an invasion of their privacy, and I did not want to stoop to that level. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this might be the only way to get them to see just how hurtful their words were. I wanted to retaliate and finally show the family how cruel they were. I was blinded by rage at that point, and I was willing to do anything to get the upper hand by hook or crook. So I started recording. Whenever they were around, I would turn on voice memo applications on my phone and just let it run in the pocket. Sure enough, within just a few moments, the criticism would start flowing, and I tried to not let it go, tried to not let it get to me, but it was hard. Hearing them talk about me like that was a real blow to my self-esteem. It was only after I started secretly recording their conversations that I began to see the full extent of their toxic behavior. The recordings made me realize that their criticisms were not just harmless jabs, but part of a larger pattern of control and manipulation. They mentioned how I was setting my sons up for failure by encouraging extracurricular activities, and that I don't love my children. They brought up how weak I am and seem as a person, and how I lack integrity. They even went as far as to question my fidelity, and how I was earning, quote, way too much for a mere painter. They claimed I was probably, selling myself and getting paid for sexual favors, and that was what expected of an artist. That's why they call them starving artists, right? I even overheard them talking behind my back about a terrible plan they planned. I knew I had to stop them. I kept recording week after week after week, gathering as much evidence as possible of their cruelness. And then came the annual family reunion. It was a big deal in the Matthews family. Everybody would come from far and wide to gather at the family home in Riverbend, catching up on old times, making new memories. I'd always felt like an outsider at these gatherings, but this year was going to be different. This year was going to be special. I'd spent weeks compiling all the recordings I've made over the past few months. I edited them down, just the worst of the worst moments when my in-laws had been at their most cruel, most dismissive time. And I had a plan. As soon as I made the decision to play the recording at the family reunion, I knew I had to be prepared for what was going to happen. It's going to be difficult and emotional. I reached out to my closest friend Rachel, who had been a constant source of support throughout my marriage. Rachel was the only person I had confided in about the true nature of my relationship with my in-laws, and she had always been there to listen and offer her advice. When I told her about my plan to play the recording, she was immediately on board, even offered to help me prepare. We spent the next few weeks strategizing, rehearsing, and how to present the recordings in the most effective way possible. Rachel helped me compile all of these voices into one audio file, and how to connect my phone to the sound system. We covered it all. But more than just logistical preparation, Rachel helped me emotionally, physically, and mentally prepare for what was going to be a very difficult confrontation. She reminded me that I had the strength to stand up for myself and my family, and that I did not have to take their criticism and manipulation any longer. She also reminded me that I had a support system of people who loved and cared for me, and that I was not alone in this fight. Her words of encouragement gave me the courage to go through with the plan, even though I knew it would be a very difficult emotional experience. By the time the reunion arrived, I felt as prepared as possible as I could be. I knew within the next few hours we were going to emotionally be exhausted, but I was ready to finally stand up for myself and let the truth be known. And with Rachel by my side, I knew I could do it. During the reunion, while everybody was gathered in the living room, chatting, catching up, I snuck away to the sound system and plugged in my phone, and I hit play. Rachel took my kids outside to prevent them from hearing the harsh words and protect them from the arguments that were about to erupt. At first, nobody seemed to notice. But as the recording started playing, the chatter in the room slowly died down. People looked around trying to figure out what was going on, and then they started listening. When I played the recordings, the room fell silent as everybody listened in shock to the harsh words spoken by my in-laws. Matthew's face turned pale as a ghost as he listened, and his eyes were growing wide with disbelief. I could see the sheer shock on their faces as they heard my in-laws criticizing me, tearing me down with every word. It was like the room had been plunged into silence. Most of the recordings earned collective gasps and murmurs, but the part about me using my body to make my money rendered everybody in the entire room utterly aghast and speechless. And then, as the last recording played, the room erupted into chaos. My in-laws were shouting and trying to defend themselves, but it was clear that they were in the wrong. Everybody else in the room was simply stunned, unable to believe the cruel words that had been said. Matthew looked at me, his eyes wide with shock. He'd never known that his parents were capable of such hurtful behavior, and I could see his heart shattering because of it. For a second, I felt guilty and regretted my decision. I never meant to hurt anybody, just bring the truth to light. He came over to me and hugged me tightly, telling me that he had no idea how much I'd been struggling. He clasped my hand, reassuring me that it was going to be okay. After the recording ended, Matthew stood up from his chair and confronted his parents, demanding an explanation for their behavior, and his voice was shaking with anger and hurt as he asked them how could they say such hurtful things about his wife behind his back. At first, his parents tried to deflect and deny it, but Matthew was relentless. He played the recordings again and again and again, forcing them to confront the reality of their words. Matthew's parents glared at me, and Matthew's mother pointed her finger towards me, opened up her mouth, and began to speak. But Matthew shook his head so slowly, saying no. I felt a wave of relief just wash over me. It was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Finally, everybody knew the truth about my in-laws, and I could stop pretending that everything was okay. I felt validated knowing that no matter what anybody said, my husband was on my side. My self-esteem rose significantly, and just that one head shake that he gave his parents, I felt so much better already. I was above their petty finger-pointing, and I did not need blames. I just had to get them to hear their own voice, and it was glaringly obvious who was at fault here. But there was one more recording to play. I've saved it for last, knowing that it was the most damning evidence of them all. It was a conversation between my in-laws, recorded just a few weeks before this reunion. In it, they talked about how they were going to break up Matthew and me, believing they could find a better wife for their son. My heart was pounding in my chest as I pressed play on the final recording, and the room fell silent once more, as the voices of Matthew's parents filled the air. We need to find a way to separate Matthew from Olivia, said Matthew's mother as her voice was dripping with disdain. I agree. She's not right for him. She comes from a middle-class family.
She's obnoxious and outspoken and has zero etiquette. She cannot continue in this family. An artist, people that work for me are starting to talk. They don't respect me anymore. We can't have this whole person who's no better than a beggar rearing my son's beautiful boys. Honey, we need to find somebody more suitable."
I felt a knot form inside my stomach as I listened to the words once again of his father, and I'd known that the Matthew parents did not approve of me, but I just never imagined that they would go to such lengths to break us up.
"Well, what do you suggest we do?"
We need to prove that Olivia is unfaithful. We'll source her payments and access her bank account. There's no way she's going to be earning by coloring some trash shapes on a piece of paper. I know she's probably getting naked with some socialite for the money," replied his father. "Once we have evidence of her infidelity, Matthew will see she's not right for him."
"Well, what if she's not cheating?"
"Well, people pay for any sort of rubbish nowadays, "Well, then we frame her. Simple as that. I know a couple of swine who could do practically anything to get in my good books. Well, we'll ask him to lie and say he was having sex with her in exchange for money. It's pretty easy to find somebody that'll help us out, trust me. We've got her this time." Oh. His mother laughed and continued, "Well, who do we choose to look after Matthew and our grandchildren? We need a splendid woman. I believe that a perfect replacement for her would be somebody more traditional and domestic. I want somebody who can cook, clean very well, who would prioritize their family over their career, who's more sociable and could fit in with their high society circles. She's just too much of an outsider and doesn't know the right social circles to fit in with our friends and family. In short, our ideal replacement would be someone who is a perfect homemaker, a great cook, a loving mother, and a social butterfly who could help elevate our family status. We could find somebody who fits the mold and make a better wife for our son than she could ever imagine to be. What about that friend of hers? Rachel it was. She seems smart and fluent in socialite languages, and she'd bring up the kids beautifully.
I don't know whether she'd marry Matthew, though.
She loves that stupid woman too much. Well, anyone can be bought with a little bit of money." I felt a wave of nauseousness wash over me as I heard the cruel plan. I couldn't believe that they were willing to destroy my marriage because they simply did not like me. As the recording played out, the room fell silent again. This time it was a bit different, though. There was no shouting. There was no arguing. Everybody was just listening, trying to process what the heck they were hearing. Matthew's parents looked at each other and realized that they had been caught. In the heat of the moment, his mother admitted to their criticism, and she said that she resented me for taking Matthew away from them and for changing their son in ways that they did not like. She claimed I was different, too different, and that I made Matthew hate them and not want to be with them, and she said I was a two-faced, no-good, toxic two-timer who could not take care of her grandchildren, and that she did not want Matthew to stray away from their love and upbringing. For me. She revealed that she had a deep-seated hatred towards me. The root of resentment was that Matthew's mother believed that I had stolen her son away from their family. Matthew's mother had a close relationship with her son before he met me, and she felt that I had come between them. She believed I changed Matthew, and absolutely not for the better. She resented me for taking Matthew away from his family and disrupting their close-knit dynamic. Furthermore, Matthew's mother had certain expectations for the type of woman her son should marry. She believed that I simply did not fit the mold of the perfect wife, and she resented me for not meeting her expectations. These feelings of resentment grew over time, causing Matthew's mother to become increasingly critical of me and all my choices. Well, it was a shocking moment, but it was also a moment of clarity. Very much so. Finally, my in-laws have admitted what they've been doing this whole time, and as hard as it was to hear, it was also a bit of relief.
It meant that I wasn't crazy, that their criticism was not just in my head.
The rest of the reunion was very tense. Several cousins came forward with their stories, and Matthew's childhood friend came forward, claiming that they tried to pay her to marry Matthew and seduce him. Matthew's parents hung their heads in shame, not able to respond or even face their extended family. There were arguments and accusations flying back and forth, but I tried to stay out of it. I'd said what I needed to say, and now it was up to the rest of the family to deal with the fallout, you know. In the weeks that followed, well, things were a bit awkward. Matthew's parents did not come over to our house as often, and when they did, the atmosphere was so darn tense. Looking back at their reunion, I realized that it was a turning point for me. I'd been living in a bubble, thinking that I was only one who was struggling, but after the recording and the events that followed, it showed me that I was not alone. That everyone has their own struggles, their own insecurities, and I learned that it's okay to stand up for myself, to speak out when something isn't right. And I learned that sometimes the people who are the hardest on us are the ones who need our love the most.